And here we go. So the story is told of a fellow who was very self-centered. And self-centered or not, he was looking for marriage. He was actually dating this wonderful woman who they were in a new relationship, and they're getting to know each other. And they sit down and they talk. What means to talk is really that this self-centered fellow talks and talks and talks and talks and doesn't let up. And after a couple hours, he finally says, "Enough of me talking about myself. Now it's your turn. What do you think of me?" And of course, not much of a solution and not much of a recipe for a good, strong, and loving relationship. But we will discover in today's Mishnah, in the section of the Pirkei Avos, which we will read tonight, the true recipe for a real love and a real connection and a real bond. So let's look at that. This is in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avos, which is this week's portion. Here we go. Kol ava sheitluya b'davar. Any love that is dependent on something, when the thing ceases, the love also ceases. But a love that is not dependent on anything never ceases. Which is a love that is dependent on something? The love of Amnon for Tamar. And one that is not dependent on anything, the love of David and Jonathan. So love that's dependent on something else, when we lose that something else, well, we also lose the love. Love that's dependent on some kind of ulterior motive, when the motive is gone, the love will also be gone. Love that is not dependent on anything is love that lasts forever. Now the Mishnah gives us 2 examples. Both of these examples are stories from the life of David, of King David, David HaMelech. The love of Amnon and Tamar, which is our example for the negative love, for the love that is dependent on something which doesn't last, and the love of David and Jonathan, which is the example for love which is not dependent on anything and therefore does last. So some of you might remember this because we've discussed this in a course maybe about half a year ago. But these stories, the story of Amnon and Tamar, well, Amnon was King David's son. Amnon, being the son of King David, was also a half-brother to Tamar, who was a daughter of King David from another wife. Now, the Talmud discusses the strange components of that relationship, but be that as it may, he, for some reason, had a very strong crush, and a very strong pull, a very strong desire to his half-sister, Tamar. He finally came up with a plan, and in this scandalous plot, he feigns an illness and he pretends to be sick. And he asks that Tamar be sent to come help him and bring him something to eat, which she so does. And as she comes into the room, as soon as they're there in private, he unfortunately rapes her. The Talmud goes on to say that the prophet, really, the book of Shmuel goes on to say how once he had gotten his desire fulfilled, his love for her actually turned to hate, and that relationship didn't really work out very well, not surprisingly. So that was the example the Talmud gives, the Mishnah we just read, of love that's dependent on something. Love that's dependent on something, as soon as that something is gone, in this case, the attraction he felt for Tamar was gone, while the love was also gone. But it would need to be love that is not dependent on anything to be the love that lasts. So what's our example for the love that's not dependent on anything? That's the love of David and Jonathan. So who was Jonathan? Jonathan was Shaul's son, the son of King Shaul, the first Jewish king, who actually would have been king after him if not for David HaMelech, King David. Nevertheless, the two shared a very unique bond and a very strong relationship, so much so that Yonasan risked his life and put himself out for David at the times when King Shaul, his own father, tried to kill David because he felt that David was a threat to his own kingship. David was getting too popular as a military hero, and that's a whole story for itself. But Jonathan was so bound to David and felt such a true and deep love for him and a true and deep connection with a selfless one that he actually risked his life for David and saved David at a number of occasions from his own father. So that's our example of the love, which was not dependent on anything, but was pure and true, and therefore lasted forever. So obviously, these examples express the message of the Mishnah, that a love which is independent is the love that lasts, and a love that's dependent on an ulterior motive is a love which does not last. Obviously, these examples express that very powerfully. But let's break it down a little bit more. What does it mean, Ava sheitluya b'davar? A love which is dependent on something else. What does that mean? Well, we have the example here, which is a very base example, a love which is dependent on attraction. But then there are much better examples, shall we say, much more refined examples. People find common ground, people find a connection, a loving relationship with each other based on other factors. Not such primitive factors, shall we say, but factors such as common interests, factors such as common goals, and other such better, shall we say, more valuable motives that bind the two people together. And that's beautiful. But if we think about that, that love is also a love for something. There's a reason for the love, there's a cause, there's an outside motive. The love and bond is not truly for the other individual, but it's for whatever it is that we share. So if two people love music and they develop a relationship that centers around their love for music, that's beautiful, but it actually is a love for the music more than it's necessarily a love for the other individual. And what that essentially means is that the love is lacking because it's a love for myself. I enjoy music and I enjoy the company of this wonderful person while we enjoy the music or practice our musical abilities or whatever it is. So in the end, in a sense, it's more me than it is the other. So there's something lacking to that love all along. True love would be loving the other for the other's sake. Now, of course, there's the little anecdote with the king who loved salmon, and the fishers, went out fishing, and they came up with beautiful, top of the line salmon. And someone said, "The king loves salmon. Let's bring this to the king." And the salmon heard this, and he's so excited. I won't be killed this time. I won't be like the rest of the fish who've been fished out of the sea and died and eaten. The king loves salmon. He'll protect me. Well, they bring the salmon to the royal palace, and in the cargo area, everybody's saying, "Wow, beautiful salmon. The king loves salmon," and the salmon is feeling even more reassured. And they bring it up to the kitchen, and everyone keeps exclaiming how the king loves salmon. Finally, he's cooked up, and he doesn't understand why. If the king loves salmon, why does he let this happen to me? And he's brought into the king. And the king says, "Wow, what a beautiful salmon. I really love salmon." And the salmon is getting all confused. But finally, as the king leans forward to take a bite, our imaginary salmon turns around and says, "Your Majesty, you don't love salmon. You love yourself." And the salmon was a way of meeting his own interests. So, of course, in a relationship, it could be a lot better than that. Nobody's hopefully eating the other one up. But true love is not where each person or each individual, each partner is looking out for where they can gain. But the true love would be, as we expressed in the other side of the Mishnah, the love of David and Jonathan, where the love is a love for the other one's sake. How can I benefit the other instead of how can the other benefit me? Now, we find this expressed in our love for God, in our relationship with God, which is often the analog for our relationship with other human beings. Let's look at this here, where we see this expressed in our relationship with God and our service of God. So the Rambam writes, drawing it from the Talmud, that one who serves God out of love fulfills the Torah and the mitzvot and follows in the path of wisdom for no reason in the world, not out of fear that something bad will happen to them, nor in order to acquire benefit. Rather, one does the truth because it is true, and ultimately good will also come because of it. So serving God out of love means fulfilling the Torah and mitzvot and the wisdom of Torah and mitzvot, not for anything, not for a base motive, and not for a very lofty motive, just doing the truth because it is true. Of course, God does bring reward, as Rambam writes, good will also come because of it. But that's not why we do it. We do it for its own sake. We do what is right because it is right. We do for God because he is God, not for me, not for what I might benefit. Now that's beautiful and idealistic. And it sounds very beautiful and idealistic, both in our relationship with God, as well as in our relationship with our fellow man. But I'm sure some of you are wondering and maybe waiting to ask, how can such a thing be expected? How can such a thing be achieved? What does it even mean to love someone else just because? How would such a love come to be? What causes me to possibly love another human being, or in the same sense, to love God just because it is that way, just for the other? Where does that come from? How does that develop? And what does that actually even mean? Well, another teaching about our love for God and our serving God and the motives of that, another teaching here might help us understand. So let's pull that back up. The Talmud says what seems to be the opposite of what we just read. A person should always occupy themselves with the Torah and the mitzvot, not for its own sake. Because from doing it not for its own sake, one comes to do it for its own sake. So we should always fulfill Torah and mitzvot, even if we do that not for its own sake, but for some kind of benefit, some kind of personal interest. Why? Because when you do it not for its own sake, one comes to do it for its own sake, you will grow on the job and learn and reach a point where you do that for the proper reasons. So how do we cultivate? How do we develop? How do we reach a love for God, which is for its own sake, which is pure, which is love for God because of the truth, that is the truth, and not for my own benefit? It might not come naturally, and we may have to start by doing things for whatever benefit we see in it. But that will help us. The Talmud says you should nevertheless do it. You should not be discouraged. You should not feel that this is an inadequate way to fulfill the Torah and mitzvot. On the contrary, you should do it, even for the ulterior motive, because that will come, that will bring you and help you reach the situation and reach the stage and the level of doing it for its own sake. In other words, from doing things, the way we act, the way we conduct ourselves, the way we live, the choices we make actually impacts who we are. So by fulfilling the Torah and the mitzvahs, and by the same token, in a loving relationship between human beings, by treating the other with that kind of love for them in a selfless type of way, that helps develop it in ourselves. And I've used this an example before, so some of you may remember it, but I think it's a great and somewhat humorous little video clip about what happens when we do things that we may not feel like, but we go through the motions nevertheless, and now that helps us actually feel that way. So let's try to see that. No, not working right. There we go. No. Just a second here.
This is Edinburgh. According to a recent demographic study, it is home to the most miserable people in Britain. This is a good city to come to on a pretty miserable day to test out an intriguing idea. Can I give the people of Edinburgh a little hit of pleasure? No drugs, nothing illicit, simply by using a pencil. So how are you feeling today on a score of 1 to 10?
5-0.
Oh, good 5. Would you like me to add little pleasure to your day?
Go for it.
Put this between your teeth, like this. Okay? Nice teeth. Okay. Is it doing anything for you?
Not here, no. Makes you feel a bit like a horse. Very good science.
Very good.
Yeah. Don't make us feel happier, right?
It is, exactly. What happens is, when you put the pencil in your mouth like this, it makes you smile, and you're exercising the same muscles as when you smile. And what's strange is that a fake smile like this one can induce a hit of real pleasure. Is it beginning to kick in?
Yeah, I think it's quite funny though. Yeah.
Does it make you feel good?
Yeah, it does actually. I'm smiling.
You're convinced?
I'm a bit worried about how many people's mouths.
I can promise these are sterilised, carefully clean.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, I feel great.
It makes you laugh.
Yeah.
Go from a 5 to a...
Oh, I dropped your name.
So what's going on? Well, it could simply be that your brain has learned to associate smiling with pleasure. But there's another rather intriguing theory. When I smile, I exercise the major zygomatic muscles. They tighten up, and that alters the blood flow to my brain. And it could be it is that which is triggering the feeling of pleasure. How are you feeling now, then?
You have amused me. Well done.
Okay. You smile even when you're not feeling particularly happy.
I try to.
Okay.
I can.
And does that sort of elevate your mood?
I think so, yeah. I think it makes you feel a lot better.
So just by exercising these muscles, you can trick your brain into feeling pleasure. And to be honest, you don't even need one of these.
All right, so that's a little bit of entertainment, but the idea being that sometimes you might not feel very happy, but the act of smiling can bring it on. And the same way the Talmud is saying, when we fulfill the Torah and mitzvahs, even if we're not quite there yet, when we do that, that helps us ultimately reach the point of doing it for its own sake, doing it for its own purpose. But if we read this more closely, we'll be able to see a deeper understanding to this, beyond the kind of fake it till you make it attitude, where we say, do it and keep doing it until it kind of filters through and becomes natural to you. There's something fascinating in the way we read this Talmudic statement. And here we see, again, what we read, because from doing it not for its own sake, one comes to do it for its own sake. Well, in the Hebrew original, the word here is shemitoch. Shemitoch shelo lishma, from doing it not for its own sake, Balishma, we reach the stage, we advance to doing it for its own sake. So Shemitoch means from this, we reach to that. From this, Shemitoch. But actually, the word mitoch, taken very literally, means from within. Toch means inside, inwards, within. And mitoch, adding that mem prefix, makes it be from within. From within. From within shaloi lishma. From within, not for its own sake, we reach to the Shema. In other words, as if we're saying, instead of because from doing it, we would say because from within doing it, not for its own sake. And what that means is that even while we perform the mitzvah for an outside ulterior motive, for a purpose other than its own sake and other than just for God alone, even as we do that, inside of us, inside of our neshama, in the deeper part of ourselves, there is a sense of connection to God that does seek to do it for its own sake. And it does seek to do it for no personal benefit, no additional gain. And that comes to the fore as we allow ourselves to act on it. So it looks like, and it might feel like, and to our conscious selves, we are doing it not for its own sake, but mitoch, within that, there exists a spark that's inside of ourselves, which is where we do this for its own sake. And therefore, as we keep performing these mitzvahs, no matter how we actually feel about them right now, we grow and we advance to doing them in a much better way out of a true love of God. And this is, plays back into our relationship with each other. And what we talked about, love for one another, and love for a partner, and love for the people dearest to us in our life, and in doing that in the true way that we learned in today's reading, that is not dependent on something else. Because the Rebbe actually asks a question in this reading, and that's why I'm bringing it back up here. We said, and I'll read it again, any love that is dependent on something, when the thing ceases, the love also ceases. But love that is not dependent on anything never ceases. Which is a love that is dependent on something? And we go on to the examples. The question here becomes, who needs these examples? I mean, they're part of our history in a tragic way and in a more meaningful way. But when you have just this first part of the Mishnah, you understand the point. If love is dependent on something, obviously you need that something in order for the love to be maintained. But if love is not dependent on anything, will endure forever. Who needs examples to bring out what is essentially not a difficult to understand idea? So the Rebbe explains that these examples teach us the extent of it. These examples teach us how far this can really be taken. And what that means is that a person might think to themselves, hearing all of this, thinking about all of this, well, I am in a relationship, and we all are in whatever relationships we are in, and I didn't come to it in such an altruistic, selfless, idealistic way. Does that mean that my relationship is the cheap version and it's hopeless? Well, the answer is no. And this is something that is illustrated by these examples that we have here. These examples actually demonstrate to us that we are able to upgrade or unfortunately downgrade our relationships, no matter how they started. The Rebbe demonstrates this from these two stories. The love of Amnon for Tamar. So Amnon and Tamar were half siblings. They should have had, and they perhaps originally had, an intrinsic relationship. A relationship which was essential, a relationship which was out of inner love for each other. But because Amnon allowed himself to get carried away in a relationship dependent on something, a relationship depending on lust and immoral conduct, he obscured and he moved away from that true essential relationship of family that they had with love for each other. And he digressed and brought the relationship down to this kind of base one, which ended up falling apart. On the other hand, we have the love of David and Jonathan. David and Jonathan, they had nothing to do with each other originally. Obviously, their love had to be developed over time by mutual acquaintance to each other. Obviously, their love didn't just pop up one day, but as they got to know each other, as they got to appreciate each other, that love grew. So originally, their love must have been dependent on something. But because they rose above it and they continued to look out for each other and feel that bond and selflessness towards each other, they grew and advanced to the point of a true love that's not dependent on anything. So in other words, every love can be either way. It's inside of us to have the love to God in the same way to the love of those we love in our lives, our dearest ones. It's inside of us, it's mitoch, it's within us to love them in the truest and most selfless way. It doesn't always look that way, we don't always experience it that way, and that's okay. That doesn't mean we can't get there. If we keep acting on it as we've been discussing and keep doing the Torah and mitzvahs even if we don't feel it, and we keep looking out for our loved ones selflessly for their benefit, even if we kind of feel we want to look out for our own benefit, we can grow and reveal, express that selfless love, which is inside of it, the way David and Jonathan did, where they started off perhaps with a more minimal or more simple love, and they grew to this true selfless love for each other. Any questions on everything we've been discussing? Comments? Anybody disagree? If you prefer to write it, you can put it in the chat box. If you prefer to say it, you can. If neither, well, then that's okay too. In any case, we will, of course, continue on Monday with the positivity bias, with our other series, the stories and inspirational ideas from the Torah, reminding us to look at life positively. We'll be talking about actually changing our circumstances at the next class, as opposed to only the perspective on them. And then, of course, next Thursday, we will continue with Pirkei Avos with a reading from the 6th chapter of Ethics of Our Fathers, more of this Talmudic wisdom for life. So meanwhile, I hope everybody has a wonderful Shabbos. Stay safe and healthy. And
You
stay
too.
in touch. We will see you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos, Rabbi. Thank you.
Good Shabbos.